It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this first session of the second day of the conference on drama and philosophy. I'm particularly glad to present you the two speakers of this morning. And first of all, I'll say a few words about Professor José Pedro Serra. José Pedro Serra is Associated Professor at the Faculty of Letters at the University of Lisbon and member of the Center of Classical Studies, where he coordinates the research on classical culture and the origins of European culture. Among many publications, he is author of Pensar o Trágico, Thinking the Tragic, for which he was awarded the prestigious Pen Club Prize in the category of essay in 2006. Today, his conference focuses on tragedy and wisdom.
Bom dia, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you, Paul, for your kind invitation too. The early 1950s was the British publication of Tragedy is Not Enough, a translation of part of Karl Jasper's Von der Wahrheit, which first appeared in Germany in 1947. As could only be the case, the traces of devastation, barbarity and madness that had ravaged Europe between 1939 and 1945 are present, both directly and indirectly, creating the existential context for those pages. Having resisted Nazism without leaving Germany, Jaspers firmly and courageously calls on the post-war German nation to look at its recent past and its future, namely in terms of what was called the culpability of German nation. He reflects on tragedy, rejecting as insufficient the analysis that only sees in the tragic phenomenon the insurmountable and definitive triumph of suffering and catastrophe, or the illusory heroic triumph of a superficial voluntarism born out of blind, violent and brutal exaltation. His mistrust of the incantatory surrender to a hollow destruction of sense, dressed in a cloak of perverse heroism, the somber light of a dark seduction, was and continues to be opportune both for the criticism of the heroics of trumpery as well as the meaningless and blind ideal of the successful man so widespread today. More than by his reflections, however, I'm fascinated by the English title, Tragedy is Not Enough, and follow the paths it proposes. A word that invites multiple representations and fundamental emotions and wide-ranging meanings, tragedy has kept a fluidity and plasticity that mirrors the complexity of its history and the plurality of the areas into which it has penetrated far beyond the literary genre. The plastic arts, music and philosophy often invoke the tragic mode of perceiving reality, harking back to the ancient Greek legacy, albeit recreated and reinvented. It would be folly to despise these new ways of saying the tragic due to some rigid pretension limiting us to its Greek origins, and which would only petrify the tragic, denying it the dissonant flourishes it has taken on over time. All the claims made for a tragic way of seeing man, the world and life are part of the bright, restless tradition of tragedy. The last 2 centuries have, nevertheless, and despite the reservations that such generic wisdom raises, reinforced the link between tragedy and despair and the absurd, making it the preferred means of expressing and incurable existential wounds based on the preposterous nature of our condition, the errancy of our gestures, and the ruin of all teleology. A tragic sense of life, we may say a tragique mal de vivre, corrupts words and actions, gnawing away at their meaning, depriving them of vocation and finality. Accompanying the major news in the second half of the 19th century and enrooting himself in that fool's marketplace proclamation that God is dead, with consequences that no one could grasp, the time was not yet ripe, this degree of tragic despair spread and became immensely powerful. In life, as in tragedy, things end badly. As for drama, just as significant, or maybe more so than the recreation of myths or the works of the Greek tragedians in the contemporary reconfiguration of the tragic, this exploration of the limits and aporia of communication, failure, and the irrelevance of language resulted in recognition of the all-embracing absurd. Despite giving up some outdated formal aspects, abandoning the high style of Greek tragedy and focusing on the common man, tragedy found new means of expression without renouncing its older forms. We can, for example, find Ionesco and Beckett here. The irrelevance of what is spoken, or rather, the substantialization of a language that becomes self-annulling and de-authorizing to dive into a swamp of ruins, not only demanded the formulation of a new grammar and a new syntax, but also constituted a different expression of the tragic. This slide into despair and failure has betrayed the heroical and joyful intention of tragic philosophy, as created by Nietzsche, and for whom the tragic life was opposed to that of Christ, in an antithesis seeking to synthesize the opposition between his thinking and the nihilist tradition begun by Socrates. This tragic life, which, creatively, far from the earth, in the light of the midday sun and tasting the pure, fresh breeze of the highest mountains, the tragic hero would offer heavens while he danced, has, over time, been losing its splendor and enthusiasm when not actually debased by false legacies or invented genealogies. The pessimism of strength, as Nietzsche characterized the pre-Socratic moment through new categories, although, in fact, pessimism and optimism were alien to the Greeks, was weakening and changing by other hands and voices into disillusion and disenchantment, feeble comfort, routine amusement. If the interpretation of a pessimism of strength, so vigorous and healthy that it allows for a view of how the tragic myths unfolds, may not be appropriate to Greek tragedy, it has even less the vision of the triumphant disillusion, normalizing everything into deception and failure, woven on the loom of the absurd, a kind of void involving word and gesture. For the Greeks, the absurd did not cover tragedy, and the authenticity of their fates of Agamemnon, Oedipus, or Antigone, the truth they live with, could never be approximated to the egalitarian indifference bowed before the void, or diabolic paralyzation of those who disbelieve in action. Born in Greece, having returned in force during the last 2 centuries, the well-known Le Retour du Tragique, the tragic comes, however, from 2 opposing moments of tension in the same arch. In Greece, tragedy coincides with and is perceived as the dawn of a new affirmation, of a new order, of a new logos, of a way of thinking that is confident but fearful of the gods. In its contemporary return, tragedy has emerged as the fruit of a labyrinth of tiredness and tedium, fed by the debility of a reason devoured by monsters. To clearly distinguish between these 2 moments, therefore, it is important to highlight some of aspects of Greek tragedy. After an initial phase in which tragedy is little more than myths and vague names, such Thespis or Phrynichus, the 5th century gives us major insights into how tragedies were performed and their various contexts. From this vast and complex array of religious, political, social, and cultural contexts, we can state with certainty that tragedies were performed as tetralogies. In other words, 3 tragedies were followed by a satyr play. Our knowledge of these satyr plays is largely based on fragments, but they were clearly linked to Dionysus, for whom the festival that included performance of tragedies were held. Without getting involved in the problematic issue of the Dionysian origin of tragedy, this often forgotten satirical element should be mentioned, despite being so out of step with the austere gravity of the performance that took place before it. Some classicists, looking to go beyond mere description, see the satyr play as a kind of nervous unwinding, a relaxing of the psychic tension caused by the seriousness of the questions raised and the intensity of emotions experienced earlier. The spectator would thus feel relieved of the tension and psychological shock the tragic performance had brought on. Without actually being wrong, this psychological explanation is clearly unsatisfactory, as unsatisfactory in fact as any psychological approach to Greek tragedy. More than a moment of light relief and unwinding, the satyr play must have been a vigorous commemoration celebrating not only the great cosmic force, nature, sex, but also their happy agreement. The dimension of this celebration, of this agreement, goes beyond the psychological. It not only means the design, but also the joyful acceptance of the situation raised by the tragic. This is how the fatality, guilt, unawareness, or hubris surrounding and provoking the heroes into action gain a dueling place and scope. To forget the performance sequence and separate the tragic trilogy from the celebration that follows it is to risk mutilating the phenomenon that is part of the overall interpretation, however much we cloak with triumphant veil and despair the tragic action of heroes. This distinction regarding the contemporary nature of tragedy also appears in the realm of politics that, in ancient Greece, were the part of the tragic performances. It is a commonplace, verging on the banal, to talk of tragedy's political dimension. The architectural arrangement of the performance space, the theatron, the responsibility attributed to the distinguished citizens who organized and financed the festivals, the crowd of Greeks and foreigners for the plays, who met for the plays, the nature of the ceremonies that preceded the performance, libation of generals, the parade of ephebes, and so on, the highly significant act of paying the tributes from the cities belonging to Delian League, a ceremony that illustrated Athens' political and cultural power, all this clearly shows the inseparable link between the polis and the theatre. In fact, without the polis, there is no tragedy. It would be a serious mistake to see this relationship as if the theatre only mirrored social and political life. Much more decisively, tragedy not only raises questions, but forces the city to ponder. It must, tragedy roles is not to be a socio-political mirror. On the contrary, it must challenge and be inventive, the creator of enigmas and aporia. In other words, it must rationally invoke, according to the categories of the 5th century citizen, the much older mythic order. The temporal difference between the mythic heroic tradition, the prime material of the drama, and the Athenian democracy did nothing to diminish the conviction, the strength of thinking, and the meaning of the action, but rather set it with a tradition from which it felt inseparable. An epic breeze blows through tragedy, and particularly through the theatre of Aeschylus. In spite of all the prudent warnings that the Persian defeat at Salamis provided the Greeks, the consequence of looking at a battle through the eyes of the defeated the powerful Asians, nothing better illustrates the cultural vigor of the Greeks, the belief in paideia, the architecture of thought, the work carried out, than the answer given by the chorus to the Persian queen, surprised by the Greek victory. Who leads them and is sole commander of the army? And the chorus answer, they are called neither the slaves nor subjects of any single man. There is no trace here of the tired tedium or the absurd I referred to earlier. Neither is it here that we find the lack of confidence and even the abandoning, as far as possible, of tradition. The feeling of guilt, which rather than expanding comprehension of reality and wisely guiding action, paralyzes it. the equivocal understanding of tolerance, frequently expressed as abdication, the defense of a cultural confusion, forgetting that dialogue implies the assumption of identity. That in Europe has accompanied the most recent resurgence of tragedy. As if we were speaking of twilight moments that by analogy we might approximate, but aware that one announces aurora with the bird pangs of the breaking down, while the other announces the dusk with the particular pains of someone witnessing the sunset. Leaving aside these ideas concerning the birth of tragedy and his possible historical mistakes, which were immediately denounced by Wilamowitz Wilamowicz's vast classical erudition, Nietzsche was right in intuiting the relationship between tragedy and philosophy, which led him to speak not only of the origin of tragedy, but also of the origin of philosophy at the time of tragedy. Part of the same historical moment, a quest for wisdom, the search for a wise orientation towards action, a kind of life regime incorporating the contemplative and the active, ran through tragedy and philosophy. Certainly, the philosophical style is distinguished in dramatic form and language form from the dramatic style, whose aim is above all to present and suggest. However, remembering some of the Platonic dialogues, which could well be called philosophical dramas, it is important, despite the differences in style between tragic performance and philosophical discourse, not to reject the possibility of ties, mutual implications, tangents. To give an example, I would underline the importance of tragedy in the constitution of juridical vocabulary and when reflecting on culpability and responsibility, for instance. What signs are there for this tragic wisdom? The question is immense, and we can easily run the risk of being dispersed. Firstly, I would like to distinguish between two plans. A, the expression of a collective political sagacity that we all become workers and accomplices in the construction of the polis and social and cultural life that inhabits. B, the expression of a wisdom of life, so to speak, that is searching for a rhythmical agreement with reality, freeing men from blindness, errors, and sterile illusions that shackle and reduce the human view. Before exploring both these plans, let us just remember that the pedagogical function of tragedy, understood as a means of educating the emotions, has been mentioned on countless occasions. House, Halliwell, Golden, Nussbaum, for example. Concerning the notion of catharsis, and referring to the Poetics, Leon Golden no longer sees it as purgation, but as clarification, and relates it to imitation, mimesis, learning with which it is association. Golden's view is that catharsis does not imply a purgation, as if were only the relieving of an excess of pity and fear, forgetting those that lack these emotions, but rather implies learning the appropriate pity and fear at the right time and in correct manner for the various events. Attributing a fitting and proportionate pity together with a just and appropriate experience of fear is not only an education, but a sign of wisdom. Let us return, however, to the two plans I mentioned earlier, the collective and individual, making these signs of tragic wisdom concrete through examples from the Oresteia. From an overall perspective, Agamemnon, the libation bearers, and Eumenides, the meaning of the trilogy is decisive for the victory of justice and culture, and is a significant moment in the history of the polis. You know the problem. There are a conflict between the Erinyes, the goddess of the blood, and Apollo. The seriousness of the problem is that the city cannot give up its claim on the constitution of the bodies that judge and the acts through which justice is applied, on pain of never exceeding the disregard primary bloods, exceeding the particularly of the clan. On the other hand, the city cannot disregard primary blood ties. How is the problem to be solved? The division of votes, the absolving of Orestes by Athenius, deciding vote, shows the balance and seeming legitimacy of the opposing rights. The irreparable nature of this opposition demands a metamorphosis, a transformation. That metamorphosis derives from Athena's attitude and her persuasive force. And I quote the Oresteia: "If you revere persuasion, majesty, the power to chair and serve that sits upon my tongue, then you should remain." It was through the persuasive words that Athene brought about the metamorphosis. By the hand of the goddess, persuasion, it means peitho, gains center stage in the polis. Around it, the vital pulse of the city beats. Only persuasion can prevent violence. This triumph of the word and persuasion is not ingenious, however, and neither is it definitively assured. As it's shown by the faithless seduction of Clytemnestra, whose false sweet words led her husband, the king, to his death. Tragedy knows that the harmonious word of wisdom can turn, changing its part completely, into the falsely manipulative. But at the guiding center of the polis resides the persuasive words and the heroic struggles that can exchange spears for words and swords for arguments. Besides this collective sagacity, there are also signs of the search for wisdom in life. Looking at the destiny of the hero, fatality, ananke, that falls upon him without making him passive, or freeing him from guilt in recognizing the aporetic situations in which the gods place them, in understanding the unconsciousness with which he errs, acting out of deep conviction, this man can renounce hubris and, I would say, almost Socratically, strip himself of falsities and illusions, finding another way of conforming with reality. Countless examples could be given of all this case. But perhaps there is none better than the teaching of Zeus as expressed by the chorus in Agamemnon. Of Zeus, who put man on the way to wisdom by making it a valid law that by suffering they shall learn. We should think about how suffering, but joined with joy, because they are not in opposite. We should think about how suffering and joy can put us on the way to wisdom. Nevertheless, those who only see in tragedy irreconcilable conflict, cycles of crime and punishment, the inevitable catastrophe, and are only acknowledging part of the immense Greek creation that was tragedy, and are forgetting the luminosity, dark luminosity many times, within the tragic performance. Reducing tragedy to the annihilation of all meaning, the destruction of all hope, the triumph of tedium or the proclamation of the absurd, is it to leave half our long journey unfinished, because from this perspective, tragedy is not enough. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have a moment for discussion right now after each conference. So, is there any questions, comments?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I want to ask you about the distinction that you didn't do between the tragic and the tragedy. For instance, if you take Peter Zondi's definition of Aristotle as the philosopher of tragedy and Hegel as the philosopher of the tragic. Can you say something about the distinction? Because you talked both of tragedy and of the tragic at the same time.
Okay. Well, I think tragedy is a creation of Greek culture. It means a construction, a literary genre, first of all. But in that literary genre, there is probably a specific way to understand the world, the life, and man. That specificity is, for me, what can be named the tragic. And the tragic way of live and of thinking is all over the time transformed. So I think in Aristotle, of course, we have a reflection about tragedy, and the poetics is a thought about the way we can create a perfect tragedy. I think even the method in Aristotle is deductive. In Hegel, as in Nietzsche and in many others, in old contemporary thinkers, I think we have a discussion about what tragic is in the context of a tragedy. What is curious for me is that all the modern philosophers like Schelling, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and so on, they have all a particular vision about tragedy. Hegel took the Antigone as the center of what is the tragic for him, and so on. So it is always a partial view about the tragic. Thank you.
I have two questions. Don't you think that the third part of the Oresteia, Eumenides, is not a solution? Perhaps I have not well understood, but I think you have said that the third part is a kind of solution for the struggle between blood and argumentative tools. But don't you think that here, there, in the Venice, we hear yet Cassandra and the murder of his mother by Orestes. Because for me it's not solved, the problem. There is a tension between the murder, not only from Agamemnon, the murder of Agamemnon, but of Cassandra, and the place, very important, the role, very important, that Cassandra plays in the first play, in Agamemnon. And I think this transformation from Eurydice to Eumenides is not the end of the thing. It is part of the problem. It's not a solution, I think. The other question is about Zeus. In this chorus, about the suffering that transforms ourselves in give us wisdom. Thank you. I think it's a very particular kind of wisdom. First of all, like be aware of being a human, being a human. And there is another Zeus, for instance, in Prometheus. And what do you think about these so opposite views regarding the God of Father, the God of humans and gods in tragedy? There's no stability towards the gods, no more.
Thank you very much, dear Philman and my dear colleague. Well, first of all, I think that in tragedy, nothing is concluded, never. So, the solution of the Eumenides is just, what can I say, is just to put the question in another level. The kind of arete we can see in the Homeric poems is transferred for another level. But, of course, it is not solved at all. As we can see, for instance, in the Sophocles plays, the tension between the state and the individual remains. So, what I think, it is just the entrance in a wisdom to say that the word, the persuasion, peitho, is in the center of the public life. It is not, that word doesn't solve the problems at all and definitively, because the Greeks knew so well that the same word could manipulate and could lead us to the falsity, as you know. And so I think that there is, of course, there is no a conclusion, but I think it is another level of the question. The second question is about the suffering. I think you read this wisdom of Zeus just as a morality, and I don't read that way. First of all, I join this suffering with joy, and not only for the Medenaren, nothing too much, which we can see just an exterior morality. I think that suffering as the joy, we can find them in life, inside life, in each moment. You know what I mean? It is not a view from the exterior, but inside suffering. Of course, there is another suffering, the suffering of Prometheus, of course. The suffering which has no justification.
The suffering for Antigone.
Yes.
Who has no, to which this sentence does not apply. Suffering and wisdom does not apply to Antigone.
But perhaps it can apply to the spectator who sees Antigone.
I don't know. I don't.
I'm sorry to interrupt, and I'm sorry for not having time for other questions, but I think the discussion might continue afterwards. So I go further to the next. So, Claudia Madeira is a sociologist.